Once upon a time, indie films were immensely popular, but today they're seeming increasingly endangered. Why does it feel like nobody's watching them anymore? It may be hard to picture today, but back in the 90s, indie movies had a cultural impact, almost on par with one of today's popular franchises. We can still see the remnants of that excitement whenever we're watching a movie by Quentin Tarantino, Sofia Coppola, or Wes Anderson. These directors who came up through the 90s independent film scene, along with Richard Linklater, Kevin Smith, and Darren Aronofsky, established distinctive individual styles or brands in our minds so that we can instantly tell when a film is theirs.
It's not the fact that I'm this big crusade against linear storytelling, all right, but it's not the only game in town.
Yeah.
But looking back, it's striking to see how much has changed since then, as priorities have shifted away from adult movies and toward mega blockbuster tentpoles or prestige-minded streaming shows.
There's a lot to be said for how these genre movies denigrated the art form of cinema.
Today, it's not the director's style, but the Marvel, Star Wars, or DC franchise identity that we look to create clear audience expectations about what kind of movie we're about to see. And directors who have successes in the indie scene jump onto superhero movies or TV projects quickly.
I put the word out there, I wanted to make a Marvel movie.
So was the 90s indie explosion the last of its kind, or can today's low-budget quality films find audiences and shape culture to come? For our purposes, independent film generally refers to a movie that was financed and produced without the help of a major studio like Warner Brothers, Disney, Sony, Paramount, Universal, or 20th Century Fox, who were the big six for most of the 90s. Many of these did wind up distributing some independent films and later forming their own subsidiaries to finance smaller films directly, but during the 90s indie boom, they were generally paying for marketing and distribution after the movie was finished. Hence, the movies were at least made independent of the big studios, and plenty never went to a major studio at all, finding homes at smaller companies specializing in indies, like today's A24. Part of what drew more attention to independent film in the 90s was the success of movies like Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs and Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi. These broke stereotypes about independent film, showing that these types of movies could be exciting and violent, not just highbrow art house fare.
Torture you, that's a good idea. I like that one.
And then, in 1994, Tarantino's second film, Pulp Fiction, took everything to the next level.
A surprise $200 million smash hit worldwide that earned 7 Oscar nominations and worldwide acclaim for its 32-year-old director, Quentin Tarantino.
Its financing came from Miramax, Harvey and Bob Weinstein's studio, which had just been bought by Disney, so by a strict definition it may not have even qualified as a true independent film, but it had the spirit and attitude of an indie, and its $8 million budget was small by any big studio standards. Either way, Pulp Fiction established a kind of formula for the runaway indie success in that era. It featured a director with a major media-friendly personality, big stars taking unusual and comeback-friendly roles, and an independent-minded aesthetic that still prioritized unpredictable entertainment over seriousness. Pulp Fiction got great reviews, award season attention, and most importantly, made a whole lot of money.
We happy? Yeah, we happy.
This helped contribute to a major indie gold rush. More titles were sold out of Sundance for more money than ever, and more studios started their own indie film divisions to pick up and sometimes directly finance these smaller movies. By the year 2000, feature debuts had been released from David O. Russell, Alexander Payne, Kevin Smith, Darren Aronofsky, Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, Sofia Coppola, and Spike Jonze. Many of these filmmakers' most loved works, like Paul Thomas Anderson's Boogie Nights in 1997, Wes Anderson's Rushmore in 1998, and Alexander Payne's Election in 1999, were actually at least partially studio financed, but they often got their studio backing because of an earlier indie movie that made a splash. None of these subsequent movies were Pulp Fiction-sized hits, but they were successful enough with critics, audiences, and awards bodies for indie cinema to become more commodified throughout the decade. The The 90s indie explosion was basically Generation X's version of the new Hollywood film movement of the late 1960s and 1970s, when a series of big-budget flops led studios to take gambles on idiosyncratic, independent-minded directorial voices and less conventional fare with countercultural energy.
What you represent to them is freedom.
Movies like Bonnie and Clyde, The Graduate, and Midnight Cowboy ushered in the primacy of auteurs like Martin Scorsese, Francis Ford Coppola, Brian De Palma, Hal Ashby, Robert Altman, Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas. But by the late 70s and 80s, Spielberg and Lucas wound up experiencing enormous blockbusting success with projects like Jaws and Star Wars, while ambitious auteur-like projects like Heaven's Gate or Francis Ford Coppola's One from the Heart turned into costly financial failures.
I feel so mixed about it. I think it's really good, but I know it won't be well received.
So just as studios had rushed away from the lavish, spectacle-driven blockbuster model in the late 60s, they rushed back toward it in the 1980s, more interested in recapturing the magic of Jaws or Star Wars box office than finding the next Coppola, Altman, or even Lucas or Spielberg. The decade's excess-driven crowd-pleasing meant plenty of sequels, in turn inspiring the real beginning of franchise mania.
Do we get to win this time?
Still, sequels weren't quite as big in the 80s as they are now, and as expensive follow-ups like Rambo 3, Ghostbusters 2, and Star Trek 5 left audiences underwhelmed, there was at least a small opening for other types of movies. Robert Redford's Sundance Film Festival was starting to gain more media attention, while some independent productions like Steven Soderbergh's Sex, Lies, and Videotape and Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho garnered attention from both critics and audiences. And important filmmaking voices like Spike Lee and the Coen brothers emerged.
What I feel what I have to do as a filmmaker is present problems so that the discussion can start.
All this lay the groundwork for the indie film boom of the 90s. For our purposes, independent film generally refers to a movie that was financed and produced without the help of a major studio like Warner Brothers, Disney, Sony, Paramount, Universal, or 20th Century Fox, who were the big six for most of the 90s. Many of these did wind up distributing some independent films and later forming their own subsidiaries to finance smaller films directly. But during the 90s indie boom, they were generally paying for marketing and distribution after the movie was finished. Hence, the movies were at least made independent of the big studios, and plenty never went to a major studio at all, finding homes at smaller companies specializing in indies, like today's A24. Part of what drew more attention to independent film in the 90s was the success of movies like Quentin Tarantino's Reservoir Dogs and Robert Rodriguez's El Mariachi. These broke stereotypes about independent film, showing that these types of movies could be exciting and violent, not just highbrow art house fare.
Torture you. That's a good idea. I like that one.
And then, in 1994, Tarantino's second film, Pulp Fiction, took everything to the next level.
A surprise $200 million smash hit worldwide that earned 7 Oscar nominations and worldwide acclaim for its 32-year-old director, Quentin Tarantino.
Its financing came from Miramax, Harvey and Bob Weinstein's studio, which had just been bought by Disney, so by a strict definition it may not have even qualified as a true independent film, but it had the spirit and attitude of an indie, and its $8 million budget was small by any big studio standards. Either way, Pulp Fiction established a kind of formula for the runaway indie success in that era. It featured a director with a major media-friendly personality, big stars taking unusual and comeback-friendly roles, and an independent-minded aesthetic that still prioritized unpredictable entertainment over seriousness. Pulp Fiction got great reviews, award season attention, and most importantly, made a whole lot of money.
We happy? Yeah, we happy.
This helped contribute to a major indie gold rush. More titles were sold out of Sundance for more money than ever, and more studios started their own indie film divisions to pick up and sometimes directly finance these smaller movies. By the year 2000, feature debuts had been released from David O. Russell, Alexander Payne, Kevin Smith, Darren Aronofsky, Wes Anderson, Paul Thomas Anderson, Sofia Coppola, and Spike Jonze. It's easy to see the indie boom of the 90s as part of a broader cycle where big-budget hubris gives way to lower-budget innovation, which in turn eventually inspires more big-budget hubris, and so on. But there were aspects of this particular movement that were specific to the time in particular. First, it's notable that the new Hollywood movies of the 1970s were often coming from within the studios. While plenty of 90s indie movies wound up distributed or owned by major studios, there was a perception, especially early on, that these movies really were coming from outside the system more than ever before, with lower budgets and a DIY sensibility. Movies like El Mariachi or Clerks made news out of just how little they cost, with original budgets well under $100,000, in a world where $2 million still counts as low budget.
It explains why the movie was so inexpensive, because I only shot 25 rolls of film for the entire movie.
The idea of being scrappy, anti-corporate, and independent-minded was cool in the early 90s, and likewise in the indie music scene. Punk, hardcore, and underground music flourished before giving way to the mainstream breakthrough of Nirvana in 1991. Just as music in the 90s took advantage of the disposable income of a younger audience, independent films made the industry see that there was money in youth culture. Movies like Rushmore from Wes Anderson and Election from Alexander Payne brought a new understanding of adolescent mindsets, while Richard Linklater and Sofia Coppola both explored 1970s youth in movies like Dazed and Confused and The Virgin Suicides.
I'd like to quit thinking of the present, like right now, as some minor, insignificant preamble to something else.
Both Linklater and Kevin Smith also turned their attention to characters in their early 20s in movies like Slacker and Clerks, highlighting the lack of direction that was becoming more common in Generation Xers with projects that avoided glossy, overly polished imagery. That youth culture cool factor affected an industry interest in these types of movies. Major stars of the 1970s and 1980s like John Travolta, Bill Murray, Matthew Broderick, and Burt Reynolds found some of their best and juiciest roles in years by signing on to movies from this new wave of independent directors.
It's so rare that good material comes across your way that you'll jump on it and often sacrifice the goodies for it.
And less established performers like Reese Witherspoon, George Clooney, Owen Wilson, and Philip Seymour Hoffman stood out by prioritizing collaborations with independent-minded filmmakers. Which brings us to another major factor in the rise of independent film, the cult of personality that formed around the directors themselves, especially writer-directors like Quentin Tarantino or Kevin Smith. These 90s indie filmmakers were probably some younger fans' first exposure to what directors and writers actually do. While they reached smaller audiences than Spielberg or Lucas, they made bold thematic and stylistic choices that ultimately made it easier to notice a personal stamp on the work. Many of these filmmakers emphasized dialogue and character over generic formulaic plots, which made movies from Tarantino or Linklater or Kevin Smith feel unpredictable.
Compare the dialogue here from Reservoir Dogs, released in 1992.
These ladies aren't starving to death. They make minimum wage. And I used to work minimum wage, and when I did, I wasn't lucky enough to have a job that society deemed tip-worthy.
You don't care they're counting on your tips to live?
You know what this is? It's the world's smallest violin playing just for the waitresses.
You don't have any idea what you're talking about. These people bust their ass. This is a hard job.
So I was working at McDonald's, but...
To Here, from Apocalypse Now, released in 1979.
Your mission is to proceed up the Nung River in a Navy patrol boat. Pick up Colonel Kurtz's path at New Mung Ba. Follow it, learn what you can along the way. When you find the colonel, infiltrate his team by whatever means available, and terminate the colonel's command.
Terminate the colonel. He's out there operating without any decent restraint, totally beyond the pale of any acceptable human conduct.
Both of these scenes are quite similar. They involve the characters sitting around and having a meal, yet the dialogue is completely different. In Reservoir Dogs, the dialogue is irrelevant. It has nothing to do with the plot of the film. There are no stakes, no conflict. It's just a normal conversation between seemingly normal people. But for Apocalypse Now, the dialogue is extremely relevant to the plot. It occurs at the start of the film and outlines the journey the main character will go on. The stakes are high and the atmosphere is tense. In contrast, the atmosphere in Reservoir Dogs is much more relaxed. It's the very first scene of the film, yet it gives no indication of what will come next. You may think this seemingly irrelevant dialogue scene in Reservoir Dogs is simply a trademark of Tarantino, but it speaks to a wider trend that emerged during the 90s. This period saw a huge boom in American independent filmmaking, with many of the most prominent directors working today having their origins in this movement. Tarantino is of course the obvious example, but Wes Anderson, Spike Lee, Paul Thomas Anderson, Richard Linklater and many more also saw their beginning within the 90s. This style of irrelevant, conversational dialogue was a key characteristic of this new movement. In contrast, a general rule for films that came before this was that dialogue had to have a purpose. You wouldn't find the protagonist of a film from the 70s casually remarking upon what they call a Big Mac in France. But this new indie wave threw this rule out the window. Dialogue moved away from advancing the story and towards a more conversational style. Tarantino spearheaded this and receives much of the credit, but many other directors, such as Kevin Smith and Noah Baumbach, also adopted this style. Linklater's Dazed and Confused is comprised almost entirely of this conversational dialogue, a film that's essentially about high schoolers just hanging out and talking about things. You can find examples of this type of dialogue in films from the 70s and 80s, with the characters just lounging around and musing about life, but these are isolated examples, but it seems to be a staple of the new wave of indie films that emerged in the 90s. After the 70s introduced such names as Scorsese and Spielberg, and the industry entered into a new age of artistic expression with the new Hollywood movement, the balance of power shifted away from the studios and towards the filmmakers. But the 80s saw an overcorrection. After the breakout success of Jaws and Star Wars, studios realised that with the right films, they could make some immense profits. The industry became more commercial, capitalising on what made Spielberg and Lucas's films so popular. There was a string of high-concept films that were easily understandable and marketable. The action film rose to prominence with Die Hard and Rambo, and numerous imitators dominating the screens. The 80s also saw the rise of the slasher, low-budget horror films that seemed to attract endless audiences, bringing in a high return on investment for the studios. But this left a gap in the market. Gone were the more artistic and stylistic films of the 70s, and gone was the auteurship that facilitated this. But a new generation was coming of age, a generation that was inspired by the likes of Scorsese and Coppola. They knew they wanted to make movies that were their own, rather than a paint-by-numbers studio piece. By the 90s, this generation had gone to film school, and were in the position to rent cameras and start making their own films. Technology had evolved in such a way that filmmakers no longer needed a huge budget to make an effective film. Young filmmakers could showcase their directing and storytelling talents for a fraction of the cost of studio movies. Kevin Smith made Clerks for only $28,000, and Richard Linklater's first film Slacker was also done on a shoestring budget, yet both sold at Sundance for millions of dollars, skyrocketing the directors to respectable names in the industry. Tarantino is probably the most obvious and successful example, with the 1-2 punch of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction. Both were low-budget pictures that attracted large-scale audiences, and Pulp Fiction earned upward of $200 million and was nominated for multiple Academy Awards. And it's not as if the studios lost out either, as they would adopt these directors after their breakout film, giving them a larger budget and creative free rein for their next project, and then cashing the check when it was a box office success. This is the path Paul Thomas Anderson, Richard Linklater, Wes Anderson and Tarantino all followed. But what exactly were the trademarks of these new indie films? What made them unique, and how did they stand apart from the high-concept blockbusters of the 80s? The specific kind of dialogue that emerged in the 90s is indicative of the type of films these indie directors were making. Gone were the high-octane action flicks, films became more somber and slower. Instead of focusing on life or death situations, they became much more grounded and relatable, showcasing ordinary people with ordinary lives. Think of Kickin' and Screamin' by Noah Baumbach, a film about a bunch of college graduates just hanging around, or The Big Lebowski, with a plot that's akin to driving down a road and taking every left turn, constantly changing direction so that ultimately you arrive somewhere, but it's not really clear where. This lack of precise subject matter and an overall more relaxed, lower stakes vibe facilitated such conversational dialogue. You couldn't have a discussion of whether or not George Washington is in a cult in The Terminator, as the characters are too busy saving the world, but it's at home in a more chilled out film like Dazed and Confused.
And George Washington, man, he was in a cult, and the cult was in the aliens, man. You didn't know that? Oh man, they were way into that type of stuff.
Tarantino is an exception to this, managing to blend the conversational dialogue and relaxed vibe with a more action-orientated plot. The 70s had a more stylistic and director-centric approach to filmmaking, but this was lost in the 80s. However, when the balance of power shifted back to the creators in the 90s, this sense of style became more prominent than ever. If we think of some of the most stylistic directors, the names that come to mind are often directors who entered the industry in this era. Wes Anderson, Tarantino, Tim Burton, and many more auteur directors are from this period. Much like the 70s, strong anti-establishment sentiments were common, and naturally this seeped into popular culture. Music is the most obvious example, with the likes of Nirvana and NWA releasing music with a strong rebellious sentiment. In filmmaking, these sentiments took the form of directors reclaiming ownership of their work. During the 80s, the studios were king, exerting more influence over the films being made than the directors for the most part. But this new generation of directors wanted to put their own mark on their own work. As such, they injected a unique style to their films that no studio could replicate in good faith, making the films truly their own and not just a commercial product. And these new, more stylistic indie films were a hit with audiences. Tarantino is largely responsible for this, with his films having a strong style and very clearly being of an independent nature, yet at the same time featuring bloodthirsty action and gripping characters and stories. His films often had high stakes, yet retained the relaxed vibe of other contemporary directors. He could flip-flop between discussions about Madonna's Like a Virgin and a brutal torture scene. Other directors such as Spike Lee and Robert Rodriguez also helped change the reputation of indie films, with their work having a strong independent spirit and specific style, while retaining the excitement and violence, attracting large-scale audiences. In the public consciousness, indie films were no longer just highbrow art house fare. This change in reputation allowed for bigger audiences and made them more awards-friendly, but it's not as if they were entirely removed from the indie films of previous decades, with many older art house directors having an influence on this new generation. Another big influence on the 90s indie movement is the French New Wave of the 50s and 60s. While these French films followed quite specific aesthetic and technical qualities, the American indie films of the 90s varied greatly in terms of style and genre, from the blood-soaked films of Tarantino to the sit-around-and-talk-about-life films of Richard Linklater. The most obvious influence of the French New Wave on American cinema is New Hollywood, but we can still see traces of its legacy well into the 90s. The American indie films, this new era came to a climax in the 1999 Academy Awards, when Shakespeare in Love won Best Picture over Saving Private Ryan. While far from the low-budget independent flick that kicked off this movement in the early 90s, Shakespeare in Love was still in line with this new trend and was spearheaded by Miramax, which played a key role in the indie scene. In contrast, Saving Private Ryan was the epitome of the big-budget studio flick. Directed by an established and heavyweight director in Spielberg, having an exciting and action-packed subject matter, it was a clear favourite for Best Picture. This was a symbolic defeat for the mainstream studios, but also signified that this new indie wave was coming to an end. Independent films had become so popular, they were becoming mainstream. By the end of the 90s, most of the major studios had set up subsidiary labels geared towards indie films. Fox had Fox Searchlight, and Universal had Focus Features. These subsidiary studios were still interested in indie films, but indie films became more awards-focused and crowd-pleasing, squeezing out genuinely independent-made films. Such films of this vein include Little Miss Sunshine and other early 2000s indie hits. The balance of power returned to favour the studios. Directors lost the upper hand. Over time, these new subsidiary labels took less risk with their projects, and the indie gold rush seemed to be over, at least in spirit. The 90s stand as the last time when indie films were undoubtedly at the top of the food chain. Many powerhouse directors who act as key players in the industry today saw their genesis in this period, and its conversational dialogue, heightened sense of style and broader subject matters continue to influence cinema to this day.
Robert Redford was with it all from the beginning as the festival chairperson. His Sundance Institute rescued the fledgling festival in 1985. A staff of 13 conducted the festival in 2 Park City theaters.
I think that Park City is a good place to have it because it's got room for growth, although they've got to upgrade their facilities there.
In 1989, Sundance screened the independent film Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and it would never be the same. Even though the spotlight was now on Sundance, as the film world looked for that next hit, Robert Redford reminded all that Sundance was still dedicated to the independent filmmaker.
The tendency is to really want to reach out and become the Cannes Film Festival, which I think is a big mistake. Once you do that, it's like opening chain restaurants. You begin to lose quality.
The festival changed its name to the Sundance Film Festival in 1991. Success meant a bigger festival, but also a bigger cost for the Sundance Institute. And in it all, there were still independent filmmakers doing what was their passion.
We played the white suburban couple who get murdered.
In what?
In Fresh.
And how'd the movie do?
It did well. We won a prize.
In looking at the history, one must respect Robert Redford and his vision. It is a story that can only happen in a Hollywood film.
If you're interested in making a movie, go make one, but make it cheap. Make it dirt cheap. Refuse to spend any money and see how much you can do with your creativity. So many people come up to me and tell me, oh yeah, I made this movie. We got it in for under, $200,000, but our investors are, we don't know what we're going to do with it. And it's such a big production when you make a big production out of it. Don't. You can have a lot of fun and do some really cool stuff with just, in your backyard with a few toys. And that's it. Good luck.
So you followed women?
No, I didn't follow women. It wasn't a sex thing. I followed anybody. I just wanted to see where they went, what they did.
The name of the no-budget game is embracing your limitations. The big challenge you face is in finding the weak spots, either in the film you want to make or in your means of production. What are the things that are going to give away the fact that you don't have any money? This is one of the big reasons so many of these films are shot in black and white. Shooting in color is fine, and there are no-budget films that have done it and done it well, but black and white is just simply a less complicated process, on set and in post. And it's one that adds a pretty instant and fairly easy to maintain style to whatever it is you're shooting. Okay, so if that's color, then how about light? You may not have redheads and parkans, but you do have windows, and you can never go wrong with good old-fashioned natural light. Beyond technical aspects, though, you have to be able to search for similar problems within the confines of your story.
With no budget films, guns don't work very well, because you can never get the right replica gun. It's never got the weight to it. You can't fire blanks with it. You can't, and so whenever you'd see that in somebody's student film or whatever, it would always seem to give the budget away or seem a bit, whatever. So we used, a hammer instead of a gun because we could do a hammer cheaply and make a rubber hammer that we could smash the guy's fingers with or whatever. So things like that, where you try to identify what are the things that really betray the budget to the audience, what take them out of the film and stop them being able to engage with the film as a story the whole way through it.
Your limitations, however, aren't limited to technical problems. You have to let your limitations guide your story.
Didn't you hear me? Caitlin is really getting married.
What did you like better, Jedi or The Empire Strikes Back?
Empire.
Blasphemy.
There's an old mantra that goes something like, take stock of what you have access to, and make a film about that. Kevin Smith had access to a convenience store, and so he made Clerks. But letting your limitations guide the story goes much deeper than that. If the convenience store you have access to is only available for filming overnight, how do you get around that? Best way? Write it into the plot.
Why the shutters closed?
Someone jammed gum in the locks.
Bunch of savages in this town.
That's what I said.
Shit, if I had known you were here, I'd have come even later.
Oh, the 90s. From vibrant neon colors to those free internet trial CDs you used to get in the mail, the 90s have now become iconic as being the last decade before computers, the internet, and social media
Smoking these meats
took over the world. But when I think about the 90s, the first thing that comes to my mind is movies. And the thing about 90s movies is that they have a certain look and a certain feel to them. So in this video, just as we did with the 80s, we're going to dive into a few reasons why 90s movies feel like 90s movies. So let's start with the visuals. 90s movies look different than the films of today. They have a certain crispness to them, but still manage to retain that grainy/natural feel. During the 90s, digital cameras weren't the mainstream just yet, and movies were still being shot on film. And the film stock during that decade reached a peak in terms of quality. This allowed cinematographers to capture the most crisp images with better lighting. And you could tell, 90s movies have a different look to them than the movies of the 80s. They tend to be less grainy. But because film was used, the colors were oftentimes more natural than what we see today, because it was much more difficult to color grade before we had all of the digital post-processing tools we have today. But let's also talk about the lighting. During the 90s and in the decades prior, cinematographers used a lot of natural lighting. This often resulted in better shadows. That, combined with a higher quality film stock when compared to the previous decades, resulted in some really nice quality shots. The 90s remind me, and I'm sure a lot of you, of simpler times. Times before every single house had the internet or even a computer. Way before smartphones and social media. A time where if you wanted to know how a movie was doing, you'd either have to check a newspaper or hear about it on a commercial.
Generation X is the population of people born between 1965 and 1980. Appropriately, the X refers to something unknown, the name as resistant to definition as a demographic that carries it. Gen Xers overall had a very different experience from their parents growing up, in that during the 60s and 70s, the divorce rate skyrocketed in the US, leading to new family dynamics, and at the same time, it became more common for women to join the workforce rather than stay at home. Because childcare programs were not yet commonplace, many Gen X children spent a lot of their time with little to no adult supervision, as their parents were at work when they got out of school. That's why some use the phrase latchkey generation to refer to this demographic cohort. Their adolescence was a tumultuous time in the United States, with an ongoing crack epidemic, an increase in violent crime, and the emergence of the AIDS epidemic. At the same time, this was one of the most diverse generations in history, thanks in part to an increase in immigration and the first generation to grow up post-integration, after the end to the racist Jim Crow laws. In their youth, the media characterized Gen X as disaffected, apathetic, cynical, and slackers. They were the MTV generation, lived through the rise of music videos, grunge music, and hip-hop. They were rebellious and reluctant to grow up. But Generation X were actually the first to grow up with computers and video games at home. Generation X grew up to become the founders of the modern Silicon Valley tech industry and led the country's economic recovery of the 1990s. Their previously negatively spoken about rebelliousness and disdain for authority actually spurred innovation and disruption of many industries. And despite millennials being inextricably linked to social media, it was actually Gen Xers who founded some of the very first platforms like MySpace, Twitter, and Friendster, which Zuckerberg later used as an inspiration for Facebook.
If the 70s was coming into a curiosity of like, what would it be like if we weren't so uptight in the 60s? And then the 80s were just sort of like breaking the mold and doing a new thing and like kicking up the dust. I think the 90s to me is when the dust was sort of settling. The true spirit of the 90s was just like wanting to be yourself and this very leave me alone kind of mentality.
Do you like fatherhood?
Vodka? Yes, I love vodka.
Punk rock was never a triumphant music in America until you get to Nirvana. And Nirvana brings the middle of the mosh pit into the center of American culture. Like, how f***ed up was that? I went to weddings in New Jersey where Italian guys moshed.
I think a lot of kids is influenced by Kurt Cobain, just from the message in his music. You know, it's a lot of kids that got an infatuation with death. Damn, this dude is brave. Like, he's not afraid to die. So it's like, you know, going all out. And these on-edge artists like this, and just like their beliefs and the grunge and the style and just the vibe, I think kids they want to live that way. They want to see what he felt like.
We don't need the Lover from the 60s. We don't need punk from the 70s or this androgynous player from the 80s. No, we need something simple, something destructive, something grounding.
I mean, the 90s was about sort of alt culture. It was about not buying anything. It was super thrift store, anti-consumerist, you know, it was about not caring and looking like you didn't care. Of course, what was happening in rap was an antithesis to that.
You get to the middle of the 90s and you've got two poles of hip hop, East Coast and West Coast. West Coast is very much about street culture.
Yes, I am gonna say that I'm a thug. That's because I came from the gutter and I'm still here.
East Coast, something else. East Coast is mostly a puffy thing. And Puffy is a grand entertainer and party thrower. Maybe a better party impresario than perhaps a rapper? I didn't say it, don't be mad at me, Puff.
Biggie Smalls was like always talking about Coogee sweaters. He was flexing with his chains and his sunglasses. And yeah, so it's like sort of excess that was a contrast to what the grunge movement was happening in like rock and alternative music at that time.
That intersection of like fashion brands and mainstream culture with like MTV, VH1, Request Video coming in and just like creating this whole 360 of what celebrity or what music or what fashion or what culture was, I think that was the big boom.
From 1989 to 1999, Disney returned to producing critically acclaimed and commercially successful animated films. This era of Disney is what we now refer to as the Disney Renaissance. During this time, the movie that Disney was producing were mostly musical adaptations of well-known stories. And this wasn't only a return to form, but it was also a return to its roots because it mimicked what Walt Disney did by adapting well-known stories during the 1930s to 1960s. As a 90s kid, Disney animated films were a huge part of my life and are a source of major nostalgia for me. The Little Mermaid, The Rescuers Down Under, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, Mulan, and Tarzan. I dare you to try naming a more iconic and classic set of movies produced by another studio in such a short period of time. Maybe only Pixar can compare.
Encontradas en la casa de O.J. Simpson. They have come from across the globe, bringing their satellite trucks, pulling miles of cable, setting up housekeeping and putting down stakes. You might not believe it, but they're here to stay a while.
I found 49 cameramen, 25 anchors, 20 producers I could see, but a lot of them were inside a truck.
With them come the t-shirt hawkers.
OJ today, OJ.
The attention seekers, the curious.
Please don't forget the victims.
I think there is an amazing, ravenous appetite for information about O.J. Simpson. A few of the board take time for a nap, while the chorus line of reporters outside the criminal courts building give live analysis.
Simpson sits at the defense table wearing a dark suit and tie and a grim expression.
Blood stain and fiber evidence is substantial enough for samples to be shared between the prosecution and the defense.
Inside the court building, another zoo. Reporters sit glued to small monitors, watching, waiting for any new evidence in the case that's captured the attention of the world.
That's Nicole's mother and sister.
Write down 1058.
Did you get that?
Local Los Angeles television stations eclipsed an entire day of programming for the testimony. How much is too much? And is the public served by all this?
I have been since childhood an inveterate moviegoer.
The next president of the United States is more than an inveterate moviegoer. He is positively preoccupied with the cinema.
Did you see Sister Act? I love that. I wanted to be in that choir so bad I could spit.
He goes to virtually every movie he can possibly see, loves taking his daughter to the movies. They go very frequently together, and the whole family goes to the movies.
High Noon is Bill Clinton's favorite film. He has seen it 20 times, a choice that goes over well with his Hollywood supporters.
Well, I like the heroic side of that. You know, certainly High Noon is the man who's going to stand for what he feels is right, to protect his community, his own sense of self.
Another Clinton favorite is Field of Dreams. It is the movie he wants everyone in America to see because of its message. If you build it, they will come.
You know, it's such a fabulous fairy tale and makes people feel that anything can happen. And in a sense, this campaign was a little bit of Field of Dreams as it started out.
Bill Clinton is moving into the White House with the knowledge that during the election campaign, he was widely supported by the filmmaking community in Hollywood. To many movie stars, Clinton's arrival here in Washington is being viewed in the most glowing terms.